I currently work as a professor at Griffith University and in Australia at Delft University in the Netherlands, and here in Aussie I run the Safety Science Innovation Lab.
A health and safety lawyer. I practice across the world in relation to responding to incidents and advising boards in relation to their compliance needs. And I'm currently the global head of health and safety at Clyde & Co. And its Australian managing partner.
Current practices around safety metrics are getting us to look at the wrong things and lead to counterproductive incentives and misguided outcomes and directions for boards to base their decisions on.
Well, it seems to me that one of the objectives, amongst others, for measuring health and safety metrics is to assure board members of compliance with work health and safety obligations or occupational health and safety obligations that the organisation has as part of their corporate governance needs. But it seems to me that if that is the objective, then the metric itself needs to actually give some guidance that is consistent with that objective. And at the moment, the current approaches don't reflect that. They neither give a good indication of practices or the state of safety in the organisation, nor do they give any level of assurance in relation to health and safety compliance. So in a sense, because they are somewhat misguided, they provide false comfort for boards and board members in relation to the state of safety in their organisation, which seems to me to be a really good reason to revisit the way in which we measure health and safety metrics.
Sorry, I would like to add to that. In addition to the board perhaps misleading itself with seemingly relevant information around safety and safety metrics, the current crop of safety metrics gets boards and executive teams to focus on the kinds of things that then filter down into an organization and may in fact incentivize reporting or not reporting, incentivize things that ultimately end up being rather counterproductive to safety and productivity down at the sharp end.
That's an interesting question. My philosophical view in relation to incentives is that incentives are fine in every aspect of promoting behaviour, provided that the actual metric that underpins that incentive promotes the right behaviour. The difficulty at the moment is that where those metrics are the current crop of metrics, which are TRIFR, LTIFRs, or similar metrics, they are things that not only are not within the control of the individual senior managers that are being held accountable to them through the incentive scheme, but worse still, they incentivise the sort of negative behaviour of underreporting, of manipulating of data, all of the things that have a detriment to overall safety outcomes, and actually create a whole bunch of bureaucracy of trying to manipulate the data for no end at all, other than actually dressing up the information. And you see that in your travels. You actually see that in interactions with senior managers who are subject to those type of KPIs from an incentive perspective, who have that bonuses tied up to those type of things. They behave in a certain type of predictable way. And it's actually quite disappointing, really, because something that may have been a good idea in someone's mind at some point, in terms of trying to align senior management behaviour to safety performance, has really been undermined by the fact that you are using the wrong metrics to measure that performance. So I actually think there is a role for having incentives for good safety performance if the underpinning performance is one that is within the control of the senior manager, which is why you actually need to revisit and revise the way in which you measure the metrics in the first place.
The shorthand and cynical way in which this often gets phrased out in the industry is that rather than LTIs and MTIs and such measurements on which we base various incentives, people have started talking about the LGI, which is the Looking Good Index. And what that already suggests is that many of the incentives that we have focus behaviors on looking good in terms of managing reputation, managing peer status, managing liabilities even, things that ultimately are counterproductive to the goals that the measures would have had at their inception. And so this is an important observation. We need to go back on the science of this. Science has shown very clearly that if you are already very safe, which most organizations in the Western world are, then the relationship between the absence of negatives, that is, you have very few incidents, and the predictive capacity of that in terms of having big disasters or fatal accidents is becoming very, very difficult. And because you have so few negative events, it becomes really difficult to learn anything of value from them because they're so tiny. And the more we focus on reducing the number of negative events, the less we are able to learn. And so science shows that the safer you are, the more important it becomes to see safety not as the absence of negative events, because that might even incentivize the wrong behavior, but safety is the presence of capacity. It is the capacity to make things go right. And these capacities can be found in your teams, in your people, in your processes, and these capacities should be represented in how you show, demonstrate, assure your due diligence.
Well, to me, if one of the things that we're interested in is the corporate governance activity that a board needs to engage in order to assure itself that there is a positive state of safety in the organisation, then a starting point may actually be that obligation itself, the sort of elements that go into what might be called the due diligence of a board director or of a board and the organisation itself. So you would then take an interest in the sort of things that go into that due diligence itself and try and actually match up metrics that reflect those components. Now, there is general acceptance that there are 6 components of how you would reflect and show that you're exercising due diligence. The first one might be the state of knowledge and the capacity in relation to the state of knowledge within the organisation. The second one is the understanding of the nature of the operations and the risks associated with those operations, particularly looking at the critical risks in the organisation and getting some assurance around those. The third one might be about the processes and approach that an organisation takes, and particularly looking at the resource allocation and matching those resources to the needs of the organisation at a point in time. And it's quite interesting when you reflect about that, because that often is the point at which it breaks, where we start to talk about people taking shortcuts or not taking shortcuts and engage in that sort of blame language, when ultimately the reason they're taking a different path or different approach is because the resources aren't available when they need them in the manner in which they need them for the work that is being done on the ground, rather than some theoretical way in which the work is supposedly done, or the theoretical circumstances in which those workers are supposed to find themselves in. So that matching of resources to needs becomes crucial in that assurance step. And then you've got to look at just the overall awareness of the performance of the organisation, the monitoring of that performance more generally, looking at the processes that enable that to happen from a system perspective, in terms of dealing with things like communication, reporting, and matching that, and that might be grouped under the heading compliance more generally. And then finally, the sixth sort of pillar of that is typically considered the verification aspect. So if you're looking for how you might frame that, it's the knowing piece or know, it's the understand, it's the resource, it's the monitor, it's the comply and verify, which are the six elements of due diligence. And that's reflected in the approach in both the literature and case law around the world in terms of the legal obligations as they're interpreted from an assurance perspective at a board and senior executive level. So if you're starting with something that you want to shape as a measure for a metric that might have some meaning to a board, at least from that perspective, then you might start to shape it around those six elements of due diligence and make sure that you match it with something that reflects the actual positive state in which you find yourself in relation to each of those six. I think one of the things that have held us back to date has been people's desire to have a consistently benchmarkable metric. People say that the reason they don't move from a lag indicator to a lead indicator is because they want to be able to compare their performance from with their peers within a particular industry and peers in similar industries. This is particularly the case in relation to non-executive board members, because for non-executive board members, they sit on multiple boards and they go from board to board, and there is something quite comforting about being able to compare and contrast the performance of one organisation to another in terms of the organisations on whose boards they sit on. So I think the way forward has to be a consistent metric that all organisations, or at least most leading organisations, are using, which means that there needs to be something that is an approach in relation to a metric that is defined consistently, that is capable of that sort of comparison, but yet gives you the sort of insight that we falsely believe the current metrics to provide. In other words, we need to actually be able to use a metric that not only tells you what's going on from a safety perspective, gives you some guidance as to decision making in relation to improving the state of safety in your organisation, but also because it is consistently used across multiple organisations, it is therefore capable of that comparison that I referred to before. And I think unless we move towards that future state, then we won't make the sort of progress in terms of shifting away from the lag indicators we're currently using towards consistent use of lead, not just lead, but meaningful indicators, things that actually give us some real insight into the state of safety in those organisations. So really, that is a formula for organisations collaborating with each other on determining the appropriate approach and adopting that in a consistent way within their organisation.
One of the failure modes of the proposal that Michael has put forward is that organizations will sit and wait for other people to take the initiative and say, well, we can't move yet because this is not a consistent measure across participants in our industry yet. And real change, of course, all of what Michael said is absolutely required. but it may not be the way to get it started. The way to get it started is to find the courage within your own organization to start small and to say, we're not going to throw one out and import the other overnight. We're going to, in fact, dim the light on one and shine a brighter light on the other. And that we will do over time, right? So dim and shine. And as you do that, one way to do that is to use micro experiments, like you might do with any rather radical adoption of interesting ideas. Micro experiment would suggest you try this in certain of your business areas, and while you're also recording the old stuff, that's all fine. But start with the 6 due diligence elements that we've discussed in a particular business area or set of business areas. And after half a year or a year or whatever the cycle is, start comparing some of the old metrics with the new metrics, but particularly look at what type of conversations the new metrics generate within the board and within the executive. See what types of new ideas and new issues get discussed. See what positive or perhaps not so positive surprises board members might have as a result of applying these new metrics in a particular business area. For them to get both the assurance and to feel encouraged to roll it out more broadly across the business. Some organization has to have the courage to be the first one off the block, off the rank, obviously. And so that would be the organization that would be the early adopter and the thought leader in their industry.
Well, for me, they'll have insight into how work is done, and they'll have conversations about how to unblock the difficulties that workers are facing on a day-to-day basis. They'll actually be able to be curious and hungry for real innovation and solutions, and we'll be having conversations with their peers that perhaps are higher on the index than them, to try and get insights into how they are actually achieving that. They'll be having similar conversations with their own workforce on how to achieve those more positive outcomes. They'll just have a better understanding of what happens. And that's what success looks like. It's understanding how work is done and systematically removing the obstacles to work being done in a manner that achieves the state of safety.
The major difference will be in honesty, openness, willingness to disclose, willingness to reflect critically but curiously and positively on any distance or gap between how we imagine work to be done and how work actually is done to get success at the front line created. That honesty is the most important index of whether you will have a safe organization or not.